course, if we look at the idea of organizations evolving and changing and economics driving this change as organizations vary and fulfill different roles within a market, we start to see that actually far from it being a collection of homogeneous firms, a market is of course a collection of heterogeneous firms, many having a different role in the market, some large, some small, some mass producing, some looking to provide bespoke solutions for people. And we have created something that we call an organizational ecology, where lots of different organizations fit together to create a whole, a totality of organizations working together or competing with one another or creating a new market formation that is different from the market formation of neoclassical economics, and an organizational ecology that clearly more accurately represents what we empirically see when we look at existing markets, existing industries. We see this collection of various sized firms filling slightly different roles within the organizations, some of which are growing, some which are stable in stasis, and some which are declining. So Hannon and Freeman first looked at the organizational ecology, and they effectively refuted initially, saying, well, clearly, empirically, we can see that there is not firm homogeneity. There is a large difference of things. So in order to explain this, Hannon and Freeman thought there were various axes, various matrices, various things that detect how the things were very different competencies. So they talked about the various organizations, that some organizations dealt in reliability and others dealt with efficiency. So the reliability ones would look less variance in quality performance, trying to produce things the same way that they did before. They would produce things with greater timeliness. They would be quicker producers. These would be ones that would grow mass produce, very much the same sort of things. And some of them operated around certain routines, certain ways of working, so heuristics that were applied to each firm that would lead to greater efficiency, greater reliability, because they were ways in which the companies had worked, as we've looked at before, the idea of learning over time, into organizational learning, business learning. Over time, the more you produce of something, the better you get at it, the lower your average cost falls, so you become more profitable on every individual item you produce. They also looked at other things. They looked at things about accountability, with procedural rationality. How did organizations actually operate within it? What various policies and procedures did they use? How was their documentation put together? How do they process the flow of materials? How do they flow the flow of services? These are all very important things. And if organizations were procedurally rational, in which case they did things in a certain manner, that meant that actually they could make sure that what they did was repeatable over time, that organizations would do the same. Again, when you see the really successful firms in this area, sort of the big fast food joints, McDonald's with its famous booklet which explains apparently how to make every little phase, from how to produce the lettuce, how to put to the bun, etc., how to prepare it, how to toast the bun, how to fry the burger, and all these sort of things are very important that keep the system working. And so it's all documented and procedural effects and make sure everything flows through it. There's also some organizations who have the different competencies. Some of them are reproducibility, some of them novelty, some of the you see organizations that produce the same over and over again. So you sort of fast food joints again, where they try to produce the same quality burger, whichever one you go into across the world, you get the same burger, same fries, etc. Against places that might be looking more towards novelty, more towards things like high grade restaurants and things like that, which could be quite important for things. So these are the sort of areas that are this kind of reproducibility of quality in certain firms. Because what we're talking about is the fact that within the same industry, within the same market, there exists both high quality reference of fast food joints, and sometimes we may prefer to eat in one and may prefer to eat in the other, or maybe that we always eat in one type. But it's unarguable that all these different things exist. Firms are not homogeneous. So, but there's also argued about this is actually saying that Hanlon-Freeman was saying that actually it's not that these organisations are adaptive, which is of course the first law of evolution, is that things actually are primarily adaptation, but actually saying that what actually changes between these organizations, firms become for different reasons, and they have different ways of constraining them. So actually adaptation is often concerned by various things. And Hannon Freeman talk about two areas of structural inertia. They talk about internal structural arrangements, and they talk about external environmental constraints. So let's have a look at what are the internal structural arrangements that can stop firms developing. Well, there are certain things, for instance, of sunk cost constraints, just as we talked about port, that sunk costs could keep people in the industry. If you invested heavily in plant, in equipment, or even in training and development of certain personnel in certain ways, developing certain processes, we see this in the strategy firms where they develop a model of the world and one that they try and sell into other firms. It can be very difficult then to break away from that because you have to write off this. And there's a sunk cost fallacy as well. See, when you know the information is no longer any good to you, and when you know the equipment is no longer good to you, it's very difficult to dispose of it and move on to the next one. There are also internal firms that actually, of course, there are informational constraints. The organizational division of the film, where we said that they have bounded rationality. They don't know anything. The information they receive is imperfect. Different decision makers may have their boundaries of their rationality in different areas. The information they have may be slightly different. It is very difficult, therefore, to decide choose between them, especially when you get the internal political constraints. There's certain companies that will work, certain parts of an organisation will work to try and attract resource allocation to it. And once you start to receive resource allocation, your firms are very, very reluctant to give this up. And there's a great resistance to change with the idea we've always done it this way, we've been successful, or we are an important part of the organisation. It's very difficult for firms to be prepared to give up this sort of model that they've worked for many, many years on many great longer periods of time. And so this can stop a firm adapting. So effectively organizations can become trapped in a certain format within the market and not make the changes that a straightforward evolution you would expect. There are also, of course, very much dependent criteria depending on various paths within the firm. There may well be normative agreements. The company may have made long-term things through the transaction costs. We've talked about this. We sort of link these things together. Understand the agency theory that groups within a firm, they have decided they've reorganized their contracts, both those contracts that are written and those that are unwritten, those are kind of perceived normal behavior, and they've sort of brought them together. There can be heuristics within a firm that can make sure that actually firms have always operated in a certain manner. It's very difficult to actually make changes over time, which is a memory effect in which we're saying this is the way it's always been done. We need to make a change. However, there's nothing to force the change. We'll tend to stick that. So the organizations tend to settle towards stasis, as was argued by Schumpeter. And there is, of course, the double humantic, which we've talked about quite a lot, and the idea that actually organizations are products of their investigations. There were ways of looking at things and way of doing things that make certain approaches seem better. So, for instance, if we were used to a firm promoting people because they make decisions in a certain way or operate in a certain manner, then actually the people who are successful in that firm will be those who operate in that manner. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that that is the most successful way of operating. It means within the firm, the rules have been set to a certain way that makes people want to operate in that manner because they want to appear to be successful within the rules of the firm. Our theories and our models are not separate from the reality in which we live, and that is the double hermeneutic. Top of this, of course, we have large numbers of external constraints. We can make it deliberate from the very beginning with the guilds, etc. Companies have tried to set up barriers to entry and exit markets. These can be legal, they can be geographical. Countries can refuse to let people invest inside their country. People can actually say that certain companies require certain things. For instance, you may well require health and safety requirements. You may well require to be able to produce food. You may pass certain regulations. There may be certain environmental concerns. Only of these can actually be legal barriers. They can also be fiscal barriers. You need to raise money. How do you get the finance together to grow? How do you actually compete with another firm? How do you break into a market where they may already have a large marketing budget, a famous name? Can you afford to compete with them? There are also, of course, the informational constraints. We talked before this about all the problems with knowing what's going on. An organizational decision maker, how do you relate to the environment concerns? The environment is very complex. We know that we have a bounded rationality. Our information is there. We are very slow to respond to changes. We like to think the environment is stable, and we often operate, as we've seen economically, we operate historically as if the environment is constantly stable, which is why one of the reasons why models seem to work so well for so long, and eventually they collapse. They collapse because the internal contradictions of the model related to the environment eventually overcome the natural heuristic of memory effect that stops changes taking part. There are legitimacy organisations. Maybe you have a reputation for being a good firm in one area. Maybe you can move that elsewhere. But you might also be a case of, do we really want to take this risk? Our investors may be against the risk. As managers, we may want to grow the firm. Our investors may just want to take a small profit and make sure the firm keeps going. Maybe the money that's coming is to import them, so if they don't really want to take risks. And there is also the idea that actually we have this kind of idea of generic strategies that are very much pushed in modern management thinking. And yet the idea, of course, that we can collectively rationalize the fact that we make one way of approaching what is actually a complex issue of many, many different ways of doing things. So it can be very important to actually recognize that we have to stick to certain ways of operating. We don't want to really use up too many of those at any one point. So it's very important to actually recognize that actually we can often rationalize a collective way of doing things, even though it's clear that is no longer the one or only or best way of doing things.